We're going to talk to Miriam Cates now, who's a Conservative MP for Penistone and Stockbridge, because we're going to find out about the latest on the transgender wars. Parents have been blocked from checking their child's trans sex education lessons, and online pharmacies are selling transitions, DIY transitions, to children. It's a very strange world we now live in. Miriam, a very good morning to you. Thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Mike.
Before we talk about that, can I just ask you about Nicola Sturgeon? I mean, I don't quite know what it is that she detests about the Tories. She's tried to clarify it and make out that actually, it's not actually individual Tories. She just hates Tories. I mean, pretty stupid thing to say, isn't it, for a politician?
Yeah, well, this is the kind of mystery of the left versus right conflict, isn't it? That those of us on the right think those of us on the left are misguided, and those on the left think those of us on the right are evil. That seems to be at the root of these discussions. But, look, Nicola Sturgeon in many ways is a highly effective politician. But obviously I have some serious disagreements with her, particularly as we're about to talk about it on some of the issues around single-sex spaces and reforms to the Gender Recognition Act.
Yeah, well, I mean, she was very much in the news about all of that last week with her J.K. Rowling exchange, wasn't she, where she was basically saying that under her kind of belief system, it is not that trans women are in any way a danger to other women, it's abusive men. To which I said, yeah, well, then surely you would not allow those abusive men to pose as trans women and enter areas where they can do harm.
Exactly. And the problem with this whole debate is it's been framed as a culture war or about trans rights. But actually, this is a debate about safeguarding.
Yeah.
And the first rule of safeguarding is that if you open up a loophole, predators will move into it. So, of course, nobody's saying all men are a threat or trans people are a threat. We're saying if you open up a way by which predators can easily access vulnerable women and vulnerable children, they will move into that space. And then if you add on to that the fact that most people are too frightened to enter this debate for fear of being called bigoted or transphobes, then you've got an open door. And so we have to frame this as a safeguarding debate and as a fundamental threat to the safety of women and children.
Exactly right. And I'm looking at a story here which beggars belief, actually. Parents of children at a place called Hatcham College do not have a right to see teaching materials being taught to their own children.
I mean, this is absolutely unbelievable because, again, back to safeguarding, the most important way to safeguard a child is to make sure that their parents have the fundamental responsibility for that child, because nobody is more biologically, more emotionally, more financially invested in the future of a child than their biological parents. And so to separate a child from their parents in any way, whether that's through what is taught or physically separate them, is dangerous. And I find it unbelievable that schools who are in loco parentis, they're only there with the permission of parents to teach children, can hide very contentious materials from parents. Now, obviously, no parent wants to demand to see the entire maths curriculum because maths is a settled subject. We all agree that 2 + 2 = 4. But these are highly contested issues for which there is still a raging debate in the UK. And so it's not appropriate for schools not to reveal what they're teaching to children. And the previous Education Secretary and Minister both said as much. So I'm very surprised about the outcome of this case.
Yeah, I mean, I think schools have got a lot to answer for at the moment, haven't they? Because they have gone very much in that direction of, don't tell your parents, don't bring them into the conversation. We won't tell them either. And have a look at this material over here because maybe you need to read that because maybe you need to change your gender. And I don't think that's any of the school's business, is it?
No, absolutely. And here lies the issue and here lies the danger. If you encourage children to keep secrets from their families, if you deliberately cut children off from their parents, you will have safeguarding failures. And you do not need to be a student of history to realise what happens when you try to separate children from their parents. And I think, we really need to reframe this debate as about the safety of children and not as about trans rights or about a culture war. It is much, much more significant than that. And also, I think we need to look at the evidence. There's been a phenomenal rise in the number of children reporting gender distress, referred to gender clinics in the last 10 years. I think it's 5,500% increase in girls referred to gender clinics. And who knows how many children presenting with gender distress in schools. We need to stop and ask why. There's clear evidence that the vast majority of children with gender distress will desist from that and also have other underlying issues, whether that's mental health issues, perhaps they're autistic as well, hugely overrepresented in this cohort. We need to be asking why and how we can support these children, not automatically accepting that they are trans, what even is a trans child. I think we need to think about that carefully, and that they can then use facilities of the opposite sex. That is not kind, it's not compassionate to take that approach. And so I think we need to be a lot braver about how we're talking about this, and again put safeguarding front and centre of this debate.
And we hear in these sort of febrile times, you know, this phrase follow the science an awful lot. Doesn't seem to be much science on this subject of any kind, really. I mean, is there any science that people can point to say, well, this is what the natural world would say, this is what scientists would say, this is what biologists would say? We don't seem to be talking to anybody like that.
Yeah, well, I think there are some clear biological principles that hold here. So you can't change sex. I mean, your sex is written into the chromosomes of every single one of the cells of your body, and it always will be. You know, clearly some people live as the opposite sex in terms of their dress and things like that. And there have always been people who, from a very early age, often present with severe gender dysphoria. And they're what we would have used to call transsexuals. And of course, they should be treated with absolute compassion and not discrimination. And that's absolutely right. But I think that's a separate thing from what's happening now, which is this explosion of adolescents deciding that they are trans or non-binary in teenage years, often coming out as clusters in friendship groups and things like that. And you're right, there isn't that much science around this because it's so new. But that's why we need to be so careful. And I think we need to pay really close attention to the work of Dr. Hilary Cass, who you probably know is undertaking a review for the government. And in her interim report, she drew attention to the lack of evidence for this sudden onset gender dysphoria and also the treatments for it. But she did point out that socially transitioning a child, so allowing them to change name, to change their pronouns, to perhaps use the opposite sex facilities at school, is not a neutral intervention. It could have serious long-term psychological consequences. And that's obvious when you think about it. If a child is celebrated in school in front of all their peers for being brave and coming out as trans, and then allowed to use opposite sex facilities, dress as the opposite sex, you know, there's no way back from that socially for a child, is it? It is there. So that is a permanent intervention, or it could be. And schools should not be doing that without medical advice, without permission from parents. They should be very wary of this. So yes, there isn't enough evidence, and that's why we mustn't rush into accepting this kind of new orthodoxy that a child is trans if they say they are, and they should automatically be allowed to live as the opposite sex.
Right. And what about what it's like for you, Miriam? Because obviously J.K. Rowling has had some horrendous abuse and even people turning up at her house and all that kind of thing. I mean, somebody asked me earlier on, well, please ask Miriam why she's not on Twitter. Well, I think I can answer that for you. There's a very good reason that you wouldn't want to be abused in the way that you probably would be. Is it tough for you to take this issue and take it on?
Yeah, in some ways it is. And I think if it's obviously something I'm very, very passionate about as a mother, former teacher, as a woman, because I think fundamentally this is a threat to women's rights and safety. I'm not on Twitter because I got a lot of abuse during the general election campaign before I entered this debate, really. You know, I do occasionally think about going back on. I don't want the abuse, but I do want to be able to speak in this debate. But I do think it's much worse for women on the left, I have to say. My colleagues in the Labour Party who have stood up on this issue have far, far worse. I think people expect Conservatives a bit more to speak up for these kind of issues, so I probably don't get it as bad as some. But, you know, it is tough. But this is about children's safety. It's about the future of our children and young people, and someone's got to speak up.
Sure. Good to talk to you, Miriam. Thank you very much indeed. Miriam Cates, the Conservative MP for Penistone and Stockbridge.